All right, so the day before yesterday, I had begun talking about the fact that Julie L. Green recently passed away. She had been diagnosed with ovarian cancer, and she was being treated for that, but she didn't survive the treatments or the disease. And I had begun talking about her large work called The Last Supper, which is a description of prisoners who've been condemned to death by state authorities and the government of the United States, and as one of the provisions in these laws that allow the state to execute individuals for crimes that they've been prosecuted for, found guilty of, and sentenced to death for. This provision allows these individuals to request a last meal, and her work documents these last meals in a series of these paintings with this blue cobalt paint on recycled and refurbished plates, presumably purchased in thrift stores and other places where one can acquire items and give them a second life in one's own life. And I had been talking about the significance of this work and the brilliance of it, specifically how within this apparently limited and isolated form, so much comes out that pertains to the social justice issues involved in the death penalty. And today I want to talk. Today will seem like something like a digression, but it's really not. And I want to talk about the brilliance of Green's work, really in relationship to two strategies. You could say strategies, or facets or modalities that it seems to have. And I want to focus on the second one today, but I'll introduce the first one first. The first one is what I would call a rhetorical modality or rhetorical function. And it's an argumentative function. So in terms of looking at any institution of social injustice, one of the things that one aspires to do is change people's minds. And looking at the structures and forms of institutionalization, one of the ways that you can change individuals' minds is by humanizing those that are marginalized and that there's a lot of animus toward in the general cultural perception, right? So obviously in the South, there's still a lot of racial animus on the part of Southern whites directed toward African Americans, and the reason is because of this long institution of slavery. So you humanize individuals with human stories that in some way make this bias and inherent animus more difficult to participate with and to perpetuate. And so the humanization of individuals who suffer these displacements into institutional settings is what I would call a rhetorical strategy in that way. And the use of these last meals, is very good at that. So for example, one sees, cake and candy, and there's one that's inscribed with a text that said he never received a birthday party, so we gave him a cake, even though there was maybe no request for a last meal from that individual. So each one of these meals provides that human window onto the world and performs that rhetorical strategy and that rhetorical operation. And another way I think it does this work is and this is very insightful on the part of Julie Green, that she calls it the Last Supper. So reminding, presumably reminding the sort of moral majority style subject position, behind these arguments for execution to begin with, that there's sort of, in that judgment, right, is some kind of idea of an eye for an eye, which is an old biblical kind of form of justice, a very Eumenidean, pre-Eumenidean idea of justice, kind of when the Eumenides were still the Furies, right? So Christ introduces a new idea into the mix, right? And this idea is forgiveness and atonement and the cleansing of sin and this there's a narrative that the Last Supper is about this, and it's about receiving the cleansing blood of Christ, and that each member of the congregation of this kind of church, not really a church at that point, but this kind of church is to imbibe this cleansing blood in the form of wine and participate in this redemption and this cleansing of sin, which is also an acceptance of the principles that one shall not cast a stone against one's brothers. Christ reminds us of this again on the cross when he forgives someone who's actually committed a crime like theft or a crime like murder, and that there's no reasonable system of justice in Christian thought that participates in the very criminality that it pretends to be judging, right? Which would include, of course, murder and the death penalty. So it's a subtle reminder for those individuals who are supportive of this form of institutionalized violence against human life, that that's very unchristian. And the reason that is a particularly insightful and powerful rhetorical tool is because it's largely in these spatial-temporal environments in which you see a largely Christian majority, and it's often in the name of this kind of strange form of Christian values and moral sets that you find so many proponents for the death penalty. And so it's a very powerful reminder that there's quite a bit of hypocrisy for these so-called Christian positionalities to support this particular and of course not all Christians do. There were when I performed the action in 2000 in January on the steps of the Supreme Court, with my particular group, Rebellion in Brooklyn, and with Dennis Brutus and others, there were representatives from a large, number of religious groups, including Buddhists and Catholics and others that participated with us in this action against the death penalty. So it's not, of course, it's not in any way, shape, or form universal that Christians support this policy, but it is true that in states, for example, Texas, that has almost 5 times the number of executions, state executions, as the next highest state, never mind the rest of the states, right? Like, so, stay out of Texas. But, I mean, there are a lot of reasons, there are a lot of really good reasons to boycott the state of Texas, outside of their policies and the numerical data, the evidence of their use of state executions, but on that issue, that's certainly another reason to boycott the state of Texas. But if you look at the rhetoric that's produced by the politicians in Texas, and you compare it, to the executions, you'll find that there's an odd disparity between what should be the Christian values regarding life and this on this issue, and the sort of reactionary Christianized, or whatever you would call it, because it's not really Christian, is it? I mean, almost none of the Christianity that's practiced in the United States has anything to do with the gospel or the teachings of this particular enlightened Holy One. But you'll find that a lot of that reactionary Christian rhetoric belongs to the same cluster of individuals who are so adamantly in support of these racially biased and in other ways biased too, and we'll talk about that, certainly, policies of state execution. So I think that choosing the idea of the Last Supper is a very brilliant rhetorical part of the way that the work operates. And then, but what I want to talk about today is, and for me, in some ways, it's more important. It's what I've always focused on. And in the action that I did with Rebellion in Brooklyn, and I wasn't aware of it at the time, but the most important part of my involvement in the action was the argument that I made once I was in court and being prosecuted for the action, and the illegality of blocking traffic in order to call attention to the racial bias and discriminatory aspects of the death penalty in the United States, and to protest that. And and other people had different roles, and I didn't even know what my role was going to be. But it turned out that my most important part in the action was a long rhetorical argument that I was allowed to make once we were in court and being prosecuted for the action, and I was allowed to do that before a judge. And the importance of that rhetorical performance was that this judge in D.C., was also a teacher at Brown. He was at Brown, right, Laurie? Yeah. So he was also a law teacher and professor at Brown University. And so the thrust of my argument had a kind of double value. It made its way into the courts, where that's the best place for this argument to be, right? In a system where someone is actually involved in legal proceedings, and then it also made its way into the profession of education in law, and for me, that's also another extraordinarily important place for this argument to be. So that was my role in that particular action, and you might miss it in Julie Green's work, but where it enters Julie L. Green's work, Last Suppers, is in this functional aspect of demographics. And the functional aspect of demographics is non-rhetorical. So, I think the humanizing component is a rhetorical part of the argument, as is the symbolic value of the Last Supper in addressing, Christian values within this community that professes to have these values, and that so clearly violates the values or ignores them when their prejudices obviously become more important to them than those pretend values. And those two, rhetorical arguments, rhetorical modalities work very powerfully in the work. But demographics is not a rhetorical component. Demographics is an analytical component of the work, and the reason that I would distinguish the two modalities and the value of distinguishing the two modalities is this: that rhetorical arguments generally argue within a system and change a perception of the way that the information is applied to that system, whereas analytical arguments critique the structural apparatus itself, and the way that demographics do that is in terms of the legal system. The legal system is based upon this idea that the law is fair, so that we have equal rights under the law. And this is symbolized in a number of ways, with the scales of justice and other, legal symbols that emphasize this fairness. Now, the reason that fairness is important in applications of law is because if law were random, aleatory, if it were just a series of throwing the dice, then we would be back with the Furies, wouldn't we? Or, some sort of, eye for an eye, and you don't even have to prove it, right? You just, whatever the feeling is or whatever the randomness is, you go with that. So you could say that, there are some theories of ritual sacrifice that involve this idea that it was ritual sacrifice was based in this notion that when there is violence, the violence has to be balanced, but that before there was an idea of justice, it didn't really matter who you chose. And sometimes this enters the political realm of the deployment of the justice. So, for example, this individual, Leonard Peltier, who's Anishinaabe and Lakota, had been involved in activities with AIM, the American Indian Movement, and on June 26th, 1975, there was an incident on the Pine Ridge Oglala Sioux Reservation, and two FBI agents were killed as a result of that incident. Many Lakota were murdered by the FBI in the course of that incident. none of those FBI agents ever were ever questioned. The deaths of those Lakota individuals who lost their lives were never investigated. No agent of the United States government was ever prosecuted for the criminality of taking life in this incident. However, Leonard Peltier was prosecuted for the murder of these two agents that incited or were part of the incitation of this violence on the reservation, where the only reason that they had a right to be was because basically they were running an operation to shut down AIM, right? So this is part of a government operation, directed against its citizens to take away their rights to struggle for their rights, right? And I'm bringing up Leonard because I wanted to talk about the conditions under which the legal system operates, but sometimes even within the metaphysics of that system, it ignores its own logic. So Leonard Peltier was arrested, prosecuted, convicted for the crime of murdering these two FBI agents. In spite a large amount of evidence that he was innocent. Of these crimes, and during the trial proceedings, one of the statements and the arguments that was made that came up was, well, and I'm paraphrasing, but you have to go to the transcripts, but we are not entirely certain the extent to which Leonard Peltier was involved in the crime that resulted in the death of these two FBI agents. However, his significant role in AIM suggests that he had a large part and someone has got to pay. So basically, even within the trial transcripts, there's evidence to suggest that the prosecution was very much aware that the conviction and prosecution of Peltier was a matter of political scapegoating, and that's the function that it had. But political scapegoating is not what equal justice under the law means, right? So even within the legal system, sometimes the metaphysics of that system, fail to follow the structural apparatus that's demanded by it. So if you do the math, Peltier has basically been displaced from his life and institutionalized within a system of incarceration for 46 years. And and that as a result of a legal system that still demands, some kind of scapegoat for the operations of its failures, really, to allow individuals to challenge the biases and inherent oppressive aspects of the way that human life is regulated by our government. But in general, the idea of law and the idea of justice depends upon this notion of equality and fairness, right? So Julie Green's work, the aspect of it in which we see a demographics that points toward a lack of equal distribution of the system of justice. Why are there so many African American culture style meals represented in this work? Why are there so many representations of pizza and peanut butter and jelly sandwiches that seem to suggest an imbalance of in terms of the number of individuals represented from working and other marginalized classes of individuals where economic resources are not available? The class markers, the culture markers, point toward a demographics of inequality, and the demographics of inequality is what I would call a structural feature of the work, or a structural modality of the work that critiques the very metaphysics of the fairness of justice in the United States. Just like my long speech, before the court, following our action in January 2000 did, and any structural critique is important in recognizing the way that the institutionalization of sorting machines, function. So it's not merely in the criminal justice system that we see the distribution of an imbalanced demographic, but it's everywhere where individuals are sorted by these institution machines. So, for example, and this is where it's going to seem like a digression that I'm moving away from Julie L. Green's work, but I'm really not. I'm trying to bring it together with some issues that have a slightly broader purview, but that belong to the same set of political work. So the justice system's basic mechanics, right, which it sometimes fails, even in its own right, to recognize, as in the case with Leonard Peltier, but its basic mechanics depends upon this idea of fairness. And then you, bless you, that's Leo again sneezing. So then you apply, the information of the crime to this apparatus of fairness and laws, and you make a determination of guilt or innocence. And you don't look at the way that the institution itself creates, you could say, like, the environment, or if imagine that our lives are a garden. The institution itself, the failures of education, the way that our society, the racism in our society produces trauma and violence against individuals who are marginalized, whether that's racially marginalized or marginalized in terms of gender identification or sexual positionality or cognitive resources or physical limitations. The marginalization of individuals within our social construct depends on institutions of sorting, and the sorting mechanisms are always biased and always pretend to be universal, and whether those sorting machines are educational testing machines or whether they're these psychiatric performativity machines that sort people in terms of these categories of abnormal psychology that grew out of the late 19th century and were elaborated by Freud, but then have continued to hold a kind of cultural authority, even though the etiologies for these designations are no longer the same as when they were. We'll talk about that more. But I mean, that's really extraordinarily problematic as well, and that's a source of critique as well. But these sorting machines, they require in some way these delusions of fairness in order to function, and this wouldn't seem to be necessarily the case in normative psychological sorting machines, and yet in a certain way it is, and I'll talk about that and try to bring the two sorting machines, or the many sorting machines, together in some way that sheds light, on all of them and the social dynamic of all of them. So I like the idea of Julie Green, looking at this crossword puzzle for these psychiatric designations and finding, bipolar or schizophrenia or self-harm and in these words. But in order to bring, some of these, sorting machines together and to talk about their similarities, as well as their differences, I need to say a little bit about the history of abnormal psychology and etiology of these, so-called, non-normative positionalities within psychology. So, in the early part of the 20th century and in the late part of the 19th century, we really find the first what you would call modern science investigations of this category of mental illness. And we're going to stay with mental illness as opposed to criminality for a while, because I want to bring these machines together. But you could say that criminality versus mental illness has a lot in common, right? So these sorting machines are all about sorting humanity, and criminality and insanity are both categories into which human beings are sorted to, in one way or another, deprive them of humanity. So the deprivation of one's humanity is you could say an essential political function of these machines, and that function in criminality is based on a system of codes and laws, that are sort of more or less, clearly defined. And the violation of one of these laws or codes constitutes a crime. And an individual who performs an act that violates one of these laws is prosecuted for a crime, and then the criminality is judged, and an appropriate, supposedly, punishment or corrective defines that individual's life for either a period of time or for the remainder of that life, right? So, and that's called, justice. In the case of psychiatry, incarceration and institutionalization don't necessarily, right, correspond to the act of committing a crime. They correspond to a normative set of behaviors and a judgment of someone with the authority to judge what is a normative set of behaviors and apply that norm to a distribution of like a bell type of curve, and if you fall outside of that norm, then you end up being sorted into a category of abnormality or non-normative psychology. And the function of the label in this sorting machine is that it carries part of the weight of the authority. So someone can't just say, well, he's weird or strange or doesn't act this way. You have to, come up with an argument that you're providing this diagnosis, and then this label gets assigned, and then the label becomes a justification for a separation from the larger part of society or for medicalization. And medicalization, in the ideology that we have today, is largely medical, right? So it supports the pharmaceutical industry. And it supports the pharmaceutical industry via an etiology. And an etiology is, you could say, like, almost like the opposite of a telos. What is the origin, right? What is the origin of a psychiatric disorder? Like, what is the origin of criminality? Well, we never say, for one thing, the justice system isn't interested in origins, right? So the justice system, in a way, like, it totally excludes etiology from its operation. It assumes that it's just. It assumes that it's fair. And in assuming that it's fair, it has to discount the idea that there's an etiology to criminality, right? Because if it did engage the issue of etiology, it would say, oh yeah, this person committed these crimes because we created a society in which an individual that doesn't score well on the SAT has limited opportunity. And if you're, say, like someone who I worked with when I was in the ACT program, the Affirmative Community Treatment Program in Escondido, California, where I worked with an organization called, and I don't recommend it, but but it was a good learning process, Mental Health Systems Incorporated. There was an individual who had been diagnosed with schizophrenia or a schizoaffective disorder, who had done time in major institutions, who had a long background of criminality. So let's bring some of those things together. Well, this individual was Apache. He had grown up in Arizona. Both educational opportunities were limited. and jobs were limited for people like him with limited education. He had gotten involved with gangs. He had in connection to being involved with gangs, he had committed a crime. This crime had particular consequences. He did hard time, and he had also gotten involved with drugs, and all of this background material, right, that should become, you know, part of the ideology, is often discounted. And in terms of the criminal justice system, no one ever talked about this individual who I'm speaking of and said, well, this is why this criminalization occurred, right? This is why this individual did this. But the justice system's not interested in that. It's interested in prosecuting the crime, and that's fine if there's another apparatus that, you know, is interested in the ideology and that tries to really significantly remove those structural aspects of bias within our more than an educational system. It's more than a criminal system. It's our life system that we have, right? It's the connection between all of these different kinds of sorting machines. The education sorting machine, the criminality sorting machine, the justice machine. So all of you could say that each machine in a way is a mode of positionality of sorting. Like, say, like a subjectivity is someone is a woman, and then that woman or identifies as a woman, or identifies in another way, or identifies as a transgender person, and that woman or transgender person has a sexuality, and that's another component, and then that person with this particular sexuality and this particular gender identification also identifies as either, you know, Jewish or African American or Native American or Navajo or Lakota, or identifies as Chinese American, and these are multiple positionalities. And then the sum of those positionalities, and not only, you know, the way that one self-identifies within these positionalities, but the way that one is identified by the outside culture, the sum of self-identification and the performativity of culture's identification on you becomes in some way what your identity is, whether you like it or not. So if you're identifying in a way that's outside of culture, or that culture marginalizes, you always have to deal with the way that culture identifies you. You can't merely ignore it, because ignoring it is a matter of ending up within an institution, or otherwise incarcerated, or excluded from the society, or dead, right? So the same thing operates in these sorting machines. In a way, a sorting machine is a relationship to a positionality, and there are individuals, you know, that have authority, you know, to implement the workings of these machines. You know, in the case of criminality, we're talking about judges, we're talking about attorneys. They're sorting operators, aren't they? And then in education, you have testing machines like the GRE, you have the SAT, and then you have the applications of those machines. And in the psychiatric machine, you have these sorting machines that depend on labels, right? And they depend on ideologies in ways that other sorting machines, like the education machine, and the education machine can also depend on ideologies. But in large part, its claims to universalism, like justice, ignore, you know, the background information, like that we talked about with my Apache client in the ACT program, and they need to, Because just like the justice machine, the education sorting machine needs to provide a model of fairness. So I want to address this idea of etiology in the psychiatric sorting machine. I began to do so, talk about the origins of some of these etiologies. Okay, so let's go back. Let's go back to the late 19th century, early 20th century, and go back to Freud, because a lot of these terms, sort of got codified in the long and authoritative role that Freud had in establishing the mechanics of these machines. Now, the etiology has changed since Freud's time, and in order to understand that transformation, we'll begin, with a discussion of etiologies for Freud. So any non-trivial discussion of Freudian psychology has to begin with a theory of sexuality and these roles and stages that Freud articulates. It can't begin with the dream work. It can't even begin with a deep reading of the dream work and the theory of dreams of Freud. There's one of my professors, who's no longer with us, does a very trivial reading of the dream work as a theory of narrative. And the reason that it's trivial is that it begins with the dream. And it doesn't use the word telos, but it essentially looks at the dream work from the point of view of a part of that dream work's telos, which is that for Freud, dreams were a way of dealing with unresolved anxiety issues. And the telos of the dream work, one could say, is to bring repressed and suppressed anxieties in contact with that lie in the unconscious, to bring them via the mechanics of the dream work, which involve a series of displacements, distortions, and other kinds of masking, that in order to bring the material from the unconscious, where it lies suppressed and dormant, to the conscious, where it could be exposed, it has to dress it up and mask it in all of these complicated ways, so that even though it's doing a work of bringing the anxiety to the surface, like the way that one would bring the poisons of the boil to the surface before eliminating it, but it can't present this material to the conscious directly, because it would be re-traumatizing, right? So there are nightmares in which I suppose that the unconscious material is brought to the consciousness too quickly. But the mechanics of the dream work, the maskings and the disguises and the distortions and the compressions and the reframings and all of this it itself has a function of slowing down the operation, right, of bringing the suppressed and repressed materials to consciousness. So in Jungian terms, it's like a way of encountering the shadow and the things that bring about the shadow without looking in the mirror too quickly, right? So putting a veil before the mirror, or when Yoda brings Luke Skywalker to the cave, and he's like, Luke Skywalker, I'm not afraid of going in there, and Yoda says, well, you will be, but he just goes right into the cave. Well, Freud would say, well, you can't really do that. You have to put on these goggles, or put on something. You don't want to face this stuff too directly, because you're just gonna go crazy, right? So that's the, in some sense, that's the telos of all these these operations is to bring, you know, this repressed and suppressed, you know, information that is potentially traumatizing, you know, to consciousness, so that these issues can be resolved, or so that one can maintain one's, you know, ordinary relationship to the workings of the world, you know, through this kind of release valve, you know, that functions as dream. Well, anyway, so my former professor's reading, you know, sort of begins with that one idea, but misses like most of the importance of it, because the aspect that I had just described of the requirements of the masking gets left out of the discussion, right? So it becomes a trivial understanding of Freud because it fails to understand, it gets that, you know, that dreams are about anxiety, but it fails to understand why in the dream work they require all of this masking. In any case, you can't even begin there, right? Any serious discussion of Freud and any serious discussion of Freud's understanding of narrative has to begin with his understanding of sexuality. And basically the abstract simplified version of this particular etiology goes like this. And people will protest and say I'm being unfair to Freud, but that's not my job. They can complain about that later. And they can critique, you know, my version of it. But basically, in Freud's early child development processes, you see this idea that one is born an animal and has to become human, and that this is initially, you know, this initially happens in these stages that he articulates, right? So he articulates these three major stages that are sort of masculinely informed, and you could, you know, critique the patriarchy of it in that sense. We all are male subjects for Freud, and then like to become female you have to do extra work, right? But leaving that aside, okay, basically the operation is that you're born an animal, you're born an id, and you become human. And the way that you do that is through these processes that involve relationships to the body and those relationships to the body's social codes, right? So this is itself is a sorting machine. Those who become fully human and those who don't. So the operation goes like this. As a child, you know, you're an it, and you have all of these physical needs, and one of those needs is oral. So the first machine is an oral machine, and it involves the hunger of the child and the desire for the breast, right? Correct? So the first oral machine is overcoming the structural opposition between the animal's desire for satiation and the impasse of social and accepted ways of communicating need. So the child's relationship to the breast, the means that the child has for turning the oral appetites and desires of this particular need, or one could say lack, into a modality of socially accepted forms of, you know, both communication and satiation, right? So the relationship of mother to communication, the relationship to the breast, you know, as comforting versus anxiety object. Well, you know, where anxiety comes in there is this recognition on the part of the subject of hunger and desire. Maybe I won't be granted satiation, and so all of these issues, you know, that arise in terms of, you know, dissatisfaction, anxiety of of perpetual discomfort are resolved at that stage. Then the anal stage. Okay, so at some point we're animals. We have bodies. These bodies perform organic functions. Some of these organic functions are unpleasant and involve abject and uncomfortable self-experiences, both to the disposal of our body's waste and to the way that the disposal of our body's waste is perceived in social terms. So the second stage is the anal stage, in which the child has to resolve the opposition between the pleasures of expulsion and the desire to expulse the body's waste as immediately and as pleasurably as possible, and the expectations that the society has on how that is to be done, right? And so at that stage, the becoming human revolves around that process. And then the next stage is, and I don't even really want to talk about it, because the only part of the argument here really involves like these stages in becoming human and how this is going to pertain to the idea of sorting. So the next stage is phallic, and then all of these, again, Freud's subject positionalities are always male, and so there's this problem. But even if you don't think of it as phallic, you could just think of it as erotic and reproductive, or as pubic, I suppose. And so the desires that center on sexuality also have to be resolved in the same way for an individual to become completely human. And then at that stage, you enter a relationship where Freud returns us to the familiar figures of the family, mother and father, and we work out the details there with a lot of inscriptional mythological figures to support the background. All right, so failure to resolve any one of those issues puts you in one of these positionalities of bipolar or whatever. But the etiologies of these descriptors for Freud, right, belong to this schema of becoming human. So the etiology for bipolar is essentially the same as the etiology for schizophrenia. It's just a different way of failing to become human within these stages in which the body has to be articulated across the domains of social construction. So that's what the etiology is in Freud. And the descriptors, which bipolar disorder or schizophrenia or neurosis was, now it's not so much, but neurosis was a form in Freud's day, and hysteria was also a form. Now not so much, but the diagnostic manual of psychological statistics and descriptors still has a lot of these archaic categories, and it likes to assign some of these. Now, some of these assignments, have fewer consequences than other assignments, but the assignments, that remain in the diagnostic manuals are largely, still the outgrowth of the investigations of the late 19th century. Now, what's interesting is that the etiology has completely changed, but the descriptors haven't, right? So that gives rise to this, you could almost imagine it being what would it mean if you still had, you have this idea, right, where we believe in democracy and justice, but you still have human sacrifice in the society, or you have like a way of incorporating the idea of human sacrifice into your justice machine. So these descriptors that grow out of this old ideology now have to be, incorporated into the new ideology. And the new ideology basically goes like this. No, it's not about like life stages and becoming human. It's about people are born with brains, and these brains, either function normally and well, or they're abnormal brains. and the reason they're abnormal could be like a lot of different reasons, right? So one reason for an abnormal brain is the body has the wrong chemistry. So the reason that, this will cause a problem is because the brain operates through these chemistries. And, one chemistry is, so you have like an adrenaline system, and you have like all of these different chemicals that support the operations of the brain, including endorphin systems and all of this stuff. So the brain is like this huge, in a way, sorting machine. Then it sorts all these chemicals, but in order to do that properly and to function properly, it has to be able to sort all these chemicals the way that it's supposed to, in this normative way. And if it can't sort the chemicals and utilize the chemicals and produce the chemicals and absorb the chemicals and do all this stuff with the chemicals in normative ways, then there's something wrong with it. And that is the ideology of madness, though they don't call it madness today. But the other, and it's not exclusive, but it's the ideology for certain kinds of sortings, right? So sortings that basically provide you with the kinds of diagnoses that would lead to institutionalizations. I have to let my dog in because he's barking. All right, I've let him in. I'm simplifying in a way a little bit because there are really different, within these diagnoses, right? There are different levels of diagnosing. So that is actually just the ideology that contemporary, psychiatric institutions come up for certain kinds of categories, like bipolar, schizophrenia. These are the categories that are treated with chemicals. And the chemical treatments are the ones that psychiatry really like, because they support these industries and they create an economy, and they create a use value for individuals that get sorted by these machines that belongs to the pharmaceutical industry. And this is the kind of sorting that goes on in these domains of abnormal psychology that belong to social services for the large part. Now, there still is an arm or an apparatus or a wing, or whatever you would want to call it, of in psychology, in psychiatry and psychology, that relates to counseling and treatment that has to do with social experience. So one could say that part that involves criminalization or abnormal psychology as a process of how did you get there, right? So this individual is hallucinating. Yeah, this individual experiences anxiety around men. Yeah, this individual has issues obeying the law. Steals, does this to support herself, maybe even engages in self-harm. But this individual has a long history of trauma and abuse and sexual assault, and in many ways this life history can be recognized as at least part of the cause of this set of behaviors. And so there's that role as well. But for certain diagnoses, no, the ideology has changed, and you could say that there's been in the evolution of the psychiatric industry a split between the original ideology and that applies, to certain life experiences and conditions, but non-developmentally generally. But I won't get into all of that. And these etiologies of the brain, so and the brain chemistry. So first critique of this. Let's go back to Aristotle. First critique. Even if that were true, right? And the etiologies, like the etiology of bipolar, and you believe that it is an imbalance in brain chemistry. Even if that were true, it would only be the material cause, right, for psychiatric disorder or behaviors outside of the norm. You could still include factors of social environment and use of drugs, and if you wanted to obstacles in the developmental process, lack of resources, and all of the social material that goes into the mix, that could become part of the way that you formulated the etiology. It would be more complex than the way that it's done in social services and in psychiatric care, but it could be done. In fact, in the psychiatric institutions that I've worked in and with, they're very resistant, to the idea of even entertaining any suggestion like that. But given this particular kind of machine, and given this particular etiology, the problem of demographics, right, constitutes what I would call a structural challenge to the apparatus of sorting, and it does so very effectively. Now, for example, my experience of being incarcerated and spending time in asylum is limited to basically two institutions. The psychiatric ward in New York at Bellevue Hospital, and the psychiatric ward at Metropolitan Hospital. And there are two reasons that those particular. It's a long discussion. There's only time for so much, and these issues branch out in all different kinds of ways. But there are two. The reason that these two institutions are important is for historical reasons, is because Bellevue is, for one thing, probably like the most famous and widely known institution. You can use the word Bellevue, and sometimes people don't even know that it's a general hospital. They recognize it as this place of sorting individuals with psychiatric disorders. So historically, it's important because it carries that weight just in its name itself. And then the importance of Metropolitan Hospital is that when the psychiatric wing of Blackwell's Island was shut down, finally, and individuals that were still incarcerated within the asylum that was once on Blackwell's Island and became Ward's Island and Roosevelt Island and via Welfare Island, and its name was changed over the course of time with the change of and social transformations of ways that individuals want to perceive the displacement of those that are sorted in American society. and those name changes are significant, right? But the individuals who were part of the mechanics, of that separation, a lot of that population, ended up at Metropolitan Hospital, and so Metropolitan, for me, in the organization of this work, represented by other means Blackwell's Island, where would you have been if this work were taking place 100 years earlier? So for historical reasons, those sites, were of particular interest and value to me in exploring, the possibilities of a Nellie Bly kind of performance work within this mechanics of the sorting machine. So what I found, and it applies, equally, to the psychiatric wards at Bellevue Hospital as it does to Metropolitan Hospital. But what I found in terms of demographics is, in both instances, just like as an incarceration, there were higher instances of individuals in psychiatric wards who were individuals from communities that lacked resources. So there was a higher instance of individuals experiencing poverty. There were higher instances of individuals from economic domains, with more job anxiety, stress, turnover, lower pay, less opportunity for advancement. There were the demographics were unfavorable to Hispanics. The demographics were unfavorable to African Americans. The demographics were unfavorable to individuals with developmental disabilities. The demographics were unfavorable to individuals who had suffered childhood trauma. The demographics were unfavorable to women who had suffered sexual abuse. The demographics were unfavorable to women who had been involved in violent domestic situations. The demographics were unfavorable to individuals who had become criminalized for reasons of demographic marginalization. In other words, there was this most significant imbalance in demographics were individuals who, had been marginalized by, some of what, some of these positionalities that I've just mentioned, and then had become criminalized because of these positionalities as well. Meaning this, for example, so if as a child, one was a woman who experienced sexual trauma and then became a prostitute, it's these types of life stories that were extraordinarily overrepresented in these institutions of incarceration in places like Bellevue and Metropolitan Hospital, right? And it was these same, like, severely early traumatized individuals, then criminalized, and then perhaps, part of the criminalization involved drug use, which also changes the chemistry of the brain. These individuals were given diagnoses like this, right? Bipolar disorder, under the auspices of an etiology of chemical imbalance as a genetic factor, meaning that you're born that way. Your brain just doesn't know how to do it, and that's what you've got, and that's what we're going to treat you with, and that's why we're going to give you lithium, which is a poison, until you die, right? Or whatever it was. Like, so to control your behavior, we're going to give you Ativan Haldol cocktails until we can figure out, some kind of like self-important and profit-bearing chemical, like with a fancy name like Abilify or whatever, that we can make a lot of money on with this diagnosis, right? So I'm imagining, Julie L. Green looking at this sorting machine and going like, yeah, I get how that sorting machine like intersects the sorting machine that I was so interested in critiquing, and this is really very much the way that it works, and so when I say these categories are socially constructed, that's very complicated. The way that the categories are socially constructed is very complicated. And you really, in order to understand the machine, you have to understand the birth of the machine and the function of the categories within the machine. You have to understand the original etiology in a non-trivial way. And you have to understand the evolution of the etiology and the split between psychiatry and psychology, where at some point, this idea that there was somehow something happened, that the brain was either traumatized by an accident or born wrong in the inability to produce chemicals or process chemicals properly, that it has to be treated with these chemicals. And that's part of this one etiology. And then the other etiology is this social function that gets like split off. And there's no really holistic, way of bringing. The sorting machine is its own self-contradiction, and within the sorting machine, there's not an attempt to come to terms with that contradiction, or with the way that this sorting machine interacts with other sorting machines, like the criminal sorting machine or the education sorting machine, and it wasn't just on Bellevue, in the ward on Bellevue, and on Metropolitan, in these cases of extreme crisis that I saw, like this demographic representation of a higher percentage of individuals who are uneducated, a higher percentage of individuals from certain communities, a higher percentage of individuals with developmental disabilities, a higher percentage of individuals who hadn't learned to read, a higher percentage of individuals who had taken drugs, a higher percent of individuals who had done criminal time, a higher percent of individuals who had suffered traumas of war, a higher percent of individuals who had been abused in other ways. It wasn't just in the settings of crisis that I found this, but in the very apparatus of the institution itself in other ways. So, for example, when I worked at the ACT program in Escondido, California, under this designator affirmative community treatment, and the ACT program could very much be considered the third act in my work acts. Like, the first act would have been asylums, and the work that resulted in the asylum pieces, and then the second act would have been the historical exploration of both the physical institutions, the architecture of institutionalization, and specifically that architecture's relationship to the isolation on Roosevelt Island or Blackwell's Island, but historically elsewhere as well. And then the third act, would be the work that I did in a totally different positionality in this ACT program. But the ACT program brought together two things. It brought together criminalization and the institutionalization of the criminal justice system and psychiatric care. And the reason that it did this was because the individuals defined in this program were not just defined by these categories, bipolar, schizophrenia, but they were also defined by their expectations, for social integration, meaning that they had either done jail time, prison time, they had been criminalized in a variety of ways. They may have had histories of drug addiction and drug abuse. They also had histories that involved emergency psychiatric care, meaning institutional in other kinds of incarceration settings besides criminal incarceration settings, meaning on hospital wards and in asylums and things like this. But in that program as well, demographics, right? Demographics, there were developmentally disabled individuals were overrepresented. In the case of women with childhood, adulthood, sexual traumas were overrepresented. In terms of racial demographics, African Americans were overrepresented. Native Americans were overrepresented in this program, right? So all of the social issues, and the importance of this is this. The program that I was involved in, the ACT program, one of the designators was severe mental illness. And the way that psychiatry defines severe mental illness in our society is with these designators like bipolar disorder and schizophrenia, whose etiology is defined as a problem with the brain, meaning that the very designators with which they entered the program, right, defined these individuals in genetic and chemical processing terms. And that these sorters, in the names themselves, right, were a means of engaging these issues as a way of sorting into this pharmaceutical industry as of this pharmaceutical industry as the way, right, of treating and producing a social relationship with individuals. When you encounter the demographics in this way and you take it seriously, it's information that belongs to the analysis of the machine itself, and therefore it operates as a structural criticism of the machine, right? And it's why when you start to talk about demographics, that you get a lot of resistance from the machine and all of the operators of the machine. And some of the operators of the machine don't even know they're operating the machine. But they are. So I think we're reaching another one of those points where I'm exceeding the boundaries of an hour, and I'm going to need to stop. So this needs to be the part 2 in discussion. that's preparing us. You recall this long introduction is like in a poetry reading when you say, and here's the background for this reading, and and then after 20 minutes of talking about how you wrote the poem or what it responds to or whatever it is, then you finally read the poem. And these pre-discussions are intended to be that kind of contextual background for what I want to do with giving a performance as poetry to some of these plates that so beautifully created by Julie L. Green, and to read them, to perform them, to perform these Last Supper mandalas as a kind of expressic poetry reading. But in order to do that, in order for it to have meaning, I do feel like I need to do all this background and put all of this context into the discussion.